Hello! Today, as part of the Montgomery City County Public Library's partnership with the Montgomery Education Foundation's MGM Leaps Summer Thematic Unit focused on civil rights, I have the pleasure of interviewing Miss Georgette Norman, a former director of the Rosa Parks Museum at Troy University here in Montgomery, and all-around fascinating individual. So, welcome, Miss Norman.
Thank you for having me and for the invite.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. So, to go ahead and jump into it, just tell us about yourself. Like, where were you born?
Well, I'm actually a native Montgomeryan. I was born right here, and I currently live in the house pretty much that I grew up in. I was born, I'm an only child of two only children, and pretty much lived a very self-contained kind of existence. I came back, I left Montgomery, I went through high school here and went to the laboratory school at that time. Alabama State had a lab school, so I went there from age 2 to finish high school. And then I left to go off to college and kind of just kept going. Kind of lived around. I lived in Norfolk, Virginia. I lived in Atlanta for a minute. Before that, I was in Norfolk when I was in graduate school. Lived in DC, left DC and moved to St. Croix, the Virgin Islands, and stayed there until 1985. I lived there about 15 years and returned home. And sometimes I wonder what I was on at the time I made that decision. But I really am glad that I returned. I think I tend to follow my muses. And when it's time to make a change, I generally listen, even though I don't understand exactly why I'm doing it.
See, that already sounds like an important lesson for someone to gain from this. Where were you, like in the 50s and 60s, during the civil rights movements of that time?
Well, I really was in Montgomery, where I am now. I was about 10 years old then, or becoming 10.
Right.
And I explicitly remember Mr. Nixon, E.D. Nixon. He was a Pullman porter. And people used to leave newspapers and magazines on the train. And he'd always bring me newspapers and magazines.
Wow.
And so, because I was a reader, I loved reading. I still am fascinated with the world and how people think and discerning why they think like that or what prompted this or that. So I had that kind of curiosity. He had been very instrumental in the 40s with the NAACP and took no prisoners, I must say. I remember the women of the movement, like Joanne Robinson and Mary Fair Burke and Hazel Gregory, who stand out for me, who really were masterminds and real leaders in the underpinnings, the beginnings and underpinnings of that movement. The voice and the words of a young Reverend King.
Right.
But mostly I think I remember the Negroes speaking with their feet. My most salient memory of the boycott is, because I love the words, and I especially love poets, Langston Hughes's words. And what happens to a dream deferred, you know? And I think that Black folk in Montgomery made a decision that if it is to be, it is up to me. And they began to make the change that they wanted to see, that this dream will no longer be deferred. And all sectors of the Negro community coalesced. You know, you had professors and laborers and maids and entrepreneurs reached out to each other in new hope and new faith. And they had these mass meetings that were kind of all over the community, where people, because it got hard. People got weary, you know, and they could get a new supply of energy to move forward. And in these groups, you know, when you're all together and you have one mind, it electrifies you. And so one more week, I can do this. You know, one more week. Little did they know it would be a year.
I was going to say, it lasted over a year, right?
Yeah. So they would be sustained by the energy of groupthink and group faith.
Right. So you said roughly the age of 10 at the time.
Mm-hmm.
How, like, were you inspired by that then, or did it come later in reflection?
Much later. In fact, both my parents had cars, so I didn't ride the bus. You know what I'm saying? So I wasn't on it. I wasn't engaged in that way. I didn't find out until I moved back home, really, those things that were happening close around me that I was unaware of, because I kind of always lived in my own little world. You know, I had my own little bubble. Right. And I remember when my father died, a neighbor who was not a neighbor when I was growing up, but who had become a neighbor, who lived like about 3 doors from me. He came up and he said, you know, I remember your mother. And I was kind of, excuse me? How did you know my mother, you know? And he informed me that one day he was up late for work, and he had been late before, and he was afraid of losing his job, you know, and he was like really kind of frantic, and he was on the corner, and my mother was driving on her way to work, and I guess as a stop sign, and apparently he saw her and asked if, you know, he needed a ride. And he said yes, so he got in the car, and they had a conversation, I guess, about whatever. And he said every day, if he was not there, she'd wait. She'd see him coming and took him to work.
Wow.
And I guess it was on the route. My mother was a teacher. She taught at Patterson School. So apparently he worked somewhere near downtown or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I'm going like, what? He said, you didn't know that? I said, I have no idea what you're talking about. He said, I don't know why you were in the car. I guess clearly I've always lived in whatever was going on around me. I think I took it all in, right. But I took it all into my own world. Right. And it wasn't until later that I began to really deal with what that was, you know, and how I was affected. And it was affected not so much in me personally doing any particular thing, but observing it. It's almost like being on high, looking down on it, mm-hmm. and taking it all in to say, what is this? And what am I to learn from this? Yeah. And as a result of that, my life, and then moving around, and from Montgomery, people always ask you about the boycott. And so my thing was always from not so much the personal, which I did experience. If you were here, you had to experience it, you know what I'm saying? Right. But looking at it from, what am I learning from this? What is it telling me about my moving forward, mm-hmm. about how I move and navigate the waters of life? And it has been extremely important with that. That's why I say, you know, the idea is looking at what happens to a dream deferred. Right. You know, so what happens to your dream when you don't act upon them? Then they drop like a raisin in the sun. And you never arrive at the destination you would have arrived had you acted on the dream.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's also interesting to think about how in the midst of the movement, like that you were actively riding it, right? Like in the car, like helping with the carpools and stuff like that. You might not see like just how impactful it is. Like even to this man who remembered all those years later, right? And could recount the story vividly.
Yeah, and other people have given me other kinds of interesting stories, and it's like, wow.
Right.
You know, I never knew, and it's what you were there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so funny. It's like when I talk about it, I can internalize it you know, in a way, even though I have no, how can I put it, cognitive memory of it.
Right.
I do have an intrinsic, you know, connection to it somewhere. It got stored in the closet of my mind on a hanger in a closet that I had not identified.
Right.
If that makes any sense.
It does.
Because
Yeah.
we're always collecting stuff, and I use that. My mind's a big closet, and I just collect things. And eventually, once you collect enough stuff on that hanger, you have a full outfit.
I like that. I like that a lot. Okay, so thinking about, you know, leaping forward in time. So how did you end up becoming involved with the Rosa Parks Museum?
Well, I'd been here been back home, been about 20 years, I guess, doing this, that, and the other. And mostly I found myself unemployable around here, but I did most of my work in the arts. You know, I was very concerned about there not being a really strong Black presence of Black artists visibly here. And I ended up being on a committee of the Arts Council, and where I was always running my mouth. And one day, Anita Foreman, who was Emory Foreman's the mayor's wife,
Right.
told me I needed to meet somebody. And I did, and we were talking and stuff like this. And it happened to be Al Head, who was head of the Arts Council. And I was chatting, you know, I chatted to his assistant and we talked and stuff like this. And we had a meeting and they said, well, Georgia, what would you do? And of course, you know, I just blurted out, you know, something, you know, that there had to be a way to create a format that Black artists could be visible, you know. And out of that came the Alabama African American Arts Alliance, which was a program of the State Arts Council.
Right.
And I did it for 10 years. And I actually had a place on Court Street that was called the 830 House, where we had discussions and readings and all kinds of things. And I brought all kinds of artists from around the country to perform, to read, to act. And we always did stuff in the schools and the community and stuff like that to create visibility, and created a registry of African-American artists around the state. So people would know. You can't say, I think the whole thing is you can't say you don't know, because most people have something hanging on their walls. You know what I'm saying? And so it might as well be somebody who looks like you, who sees the world similarly to how you see it, or how you want to see it. Or maybe like, wow, hadn't thought of that, but that reminds me of where I grew up. Or reminds me of Aunt Sadie, you know, this kind of thing. So I'd gotten to the point that I said, okay, I proved that this can happen. You know, it wasn't supported as well as I would have loved it, but you know, the idea you can't say that we can't do it. And I think it's important for young people, especially, when they have an idea to say, if nobody else is doing it, well, maybe that's my job, especially if it's on you, you know, maybe that's my job to do, you know, and what do I need to do? How do I manifest my ideas into actuality? Okay. So I was at the point now that, you know, I seem to be unemployable in the state, except that I was adjunct at AUN, but otherwise it was like, okay. And I was getting ready to leave and somebody told me about this headhunter. And so she said, I think you need to talk to this person. So I went and she said, oh my God. She says, you'd be perfect for the Rosa Parks Museum. And at that time, I'd given no thought. I mean, I think I'd heard that it was there, something I hadn't thought about it at all. I was thinking about getting out of here. And she said, I want you to take this down there and give it to the president or somebody. Anyway, I went, and the person was not there. So she said, no, go back and put this name on it. I remember none of that at this point, the names, but I did. And I got a phone call telling me to come and interview.
Right.
And I went for an interview, not thinking at all that it was going to manifest. You know, I mean, I was just there, and just kind of freewheeled the whole thing, and was there for most of the day. I mean, you know, they even had me to do a sample grant. I'm going like, this is really deep, you know. So this, I think, was on a Wednesday. And on a Friday, they called me and offered me the job.
Wow.
So I was in major shock. Okay. But I accepted. And so this is cool. My life has been dedicated to preserving history. I'm a collector both of mental and tangible history, right. And catalog it in my mind in all kinds of different ways. And the museum actually endeavored to embrace a movement and not just a moment. Endeavored to lay the events of the 50s and 55 and 56 pretty much on the social, cultural, historic landscape of a greater movement for social justice.
Right.
So it looked at it, as I perceived it, as another way station. You know, you do something and then you have to rest for a minute.
Right.
You know, and then you move on. So for me, it was an opportunity to really help the visitor to explore the myths, the prejudices, and the assumptions, and mostly the misunderstandings that encompass and separate us as humans. My hope was to give the visitor something to leave with. And basically an internal dialogue asking how much of the past is still with us? And what role do I play in its perpetuation?
Yeah.
As a result, become myself a change agent. I think one cannot unlearn something. I think one can say, I'm not going to act on it. But it's difficult to receive new information that even may counter what you believe, you know, and say it's not there.
Right.
It might make you act more in the way you were because you are fighting new knowledge. Or it will say, wow, I never thought about it that way. Okay, and that's the road to enlightenment.
I agree. Yeah, I've heard that from employees at several of the just civil rights museums or monuments or anything here in Montgomery specifically. They've talked about just the false stories that people come in believing, and how they'll come up to them after going through you know, a presentation or an exhibit and go, I never knew that. And how, like you said, it's being given new information and then seeing them actively decide what to do with that new information.
And I think that the important part of the museum is that it deals with people, with human beings. And so a people that you might have thought were less than because of your particular conditioning as to who and what they were and where they fit on that little totem pole. And you realize that they had a kind of humanity that we all seek,
Mhm.
even unconsciously, you know. And if we all had a sense of the human and not the boxes that we are pushed into, um, being reminded that I'm Black, being reminded that I'm female, being reminded that I'm poor, are all kinds of ways that we are forced to look at ourselves, okay? And at those moments with to say, but that's not me.
Mhm.
That is your definition of who I am
Mhm.
and the definition by which I choose not to live.
Right. And I would, so I think a lot of the beauty in preserving history and preserving it in the perspective of, as you said, people, like on a personal level,
Mhm.
it takes away deniability.
Yes.
It takes away the ability to dehumanize
Mhm.
when suddenly you're presented with that humanization,
Mhm.
that personal level.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's an awesome thing that the museum and yourself do and did. Yeah, it's important stuff, and I don't think they could have chosen anyone better
I don't
to
know
be
about that,
forefront
but
of that.
hey, I'm glad that I was able to serve.
All right. Um, so okay, so we've talked about actually being there in the moment in the past, the moments of the past. We've talked about preserving it a little bit. How do you feel about what's happening today? The past few years, the movements that seem to be rising and sometimes falling, rising again now. What's your take on that?
We are not doing enough.
Mhm.
In bold letters. The civil rights are not a luxury, but they're essential to all. Every age, every race, every gender, whatever your strength. Its history begins with the question of identity and membership,
Mhm.
because the US is a membership club and everybody's trying to get their card. Some cards are really easy to get. Some cards are very difficult and some never really attain it. It moves on to a role of citizen and the fragility of democracy. And I think we are seeing that today more than ever before. And many of us are looking at, how do I maintain this democracy that so many have fought and died for?
Mhm.
What role does race play in our society? What are the prerequisites for personal growth, empowerment, and self-determination? Does the elimination of discrimination and social inequities strengthen our city, our nation, and protect the rights of people? These questions were evident before the civil rights movement, and they continue to challenge us.
Mhm.
As I sit here, we need to earnestly examine and continue to re-examine the relationship between attitudes and beliefs on the one hand, and institutions and practices on the other. How do they intersect?
Yeah, yeah, I couldn't agree more.
How do they control us? and examine the moral choices we confront in our daily lives, which hopefully lead to solutions to the current state of affairs, social and political, that's so bewilderingly are so evasive, it seems.
Yeah.
But we can't give up. We have to keep our feet in the road, void of the fear, void of the blame, void of the prejudice, the finger pointing, and all of that. We have to stay on the road. As it deviates, I mean, some roads are real clear. Like right now, we're facing a mountain that we can't go around. We've got to climb it and cross over it. So there's no easy way. Each of us has a responsibility to do the work, make the demands, and seriously say, I shall not live in a captive world.
I like that. So with that in mind, say you were 10 years old now, seeing the movements of today. What would you tell yourself?
I think I would say it is up to us, as individuals, to actually make decisions that cause us to act in the spirit of all the movements that have gone before that made a difference. And one, we've got to expose all the sham in the American dream. Denounce all systems of domination and exploitation. And to always challenge the paradigm. Man, that's one we never quite think about. We always kind of have it on the periphery. But that's why we not only value the life and legacy of the boycott and all other movements, but we honor the democratic principles and the liberationist traditions in ourselves. We make the road by walking. Zen saying, don't just walk the road, be the road. Become it. John Robertson, E.D. Nixon, Martin Luther King understood that. And their walking paved the road for the rest of us. It's important that we be attuned to all areas of life as we live, all movements of our time. So we're able to grasp the deep significance of the crisis we're in right now and draw from the well of our convictions a sense of how, to what end we must strive, collectively and individually, to shape our society. At this moment in time, we must all be strident voices of change. And loud and clear, about our agenda
Mm.
for all of us, even the least of us.
So it sounds like for the young people that may hear this and watch this, the first step for getting involved is to take a step.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I like that.
You can't get anywhere standing still.
Right. And as my aunt used to always tell me, shuffle your feet in the direction. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Don't just stand, move.
There you go. I mean, that how better to start a movement than to move,
Mhm.
right? Ms. Norman, thank you. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you for inspiring us today. Yeah, I really appreciate your time and your knowledge. And yeah, I'm sure everyone watching does as well. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
All right. We'll see you next time, guys. Goodbye, everybody.